Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. The University of Southern California has canceled its main commencement ceremony, less than 2 weeks after it canceled a speech by the valedictorian, Asnat Bassam, setting off a firestorm. Police arrested over 90 peaceful protesters at USC Wednesday. Nationwide, over 500 arrests have been made on college campuses, including faculty, as student-led protests have swept the country. Just over the past day, new Gaza solidarity encampments and protests formed at Northwestern, Cornell, George Washington University, CUNY, and UCLA, among others. Students are calling for their schools to divest from Israel and stop censoring Palestinian and pro-Palestinian voices and drop charges against arrested staff and students. At Emory in Atlanta, a brutal police crackdown led to at least 28 arrests. Among those arrested was economics professor Caroline Folan, who was knocked to the ground by a police officer while another held her down and bound her hands with zip ties. We'll go to Atlanta after headlines for the latest at Emory. We'll speak with 2 arrested professors and a grad student. Meanwhile, students at Columbia University, the epicenter of the student encampment movement, filed a civil rights complaint Thursday following arrests by the NYPD and threats to deploy the National Guard. Despite the violent crackdown, students vowed to continue their protests. This is Vincent Doerr of UCLA.
I don't think that our concerns about our personal safety are at the forefront of our minds right now. I think at the forefront of our minds is the violence that Palestinians are suffering at the hands of the Israeli state every day, these last 6 months and last, again, almost 80 years.
In Gaza, the city of Rafah remains under nonstop Israeli attacks as Israel prepares to move ahead with its ground invasion. 8-year-old Abdelkarim Al-Kurd described the moment his home was attacked Thursday night.
At night, we were sleeping quietly, my brother and I, in a bedroom. My mother and my grandfather were awake, so when they shelled, the rubble was above our heads, and the glass was shattered, and the house was smashed. Here, if you want, go and look. The whole house was destroyed. Nothing is left in it.
In other news from the region, a Hamas official said the group would disarm if an independent Palestinian state is established and refugees are allowed to return. The New York Court of Appeals overturned the 2020 rape conviction of Harvey Weinstein Thursday and called for a new trial in a stunning development in his historic case. The disgraced Hollywood mogul was sentenced to 23 years in prison after his 2020 conviction. But the appeals court cited the improper use of what's known as prior bad acts witnesses. In this case, that refers to survivors of Weinstein that testified about their assaults, even though they were not part of the case being tried. Tarana Burke, founder of the Me Too movement, addressed the news yesterday.
We are devastated for the survivors who are connected to this case and the survivors who had found some solace and catharsis in the original verdict around Harvey Weinstein. We also need to understand that the legal system has never served survivors in this country. Carceral solutions won't save us.
Harvey Weinstein's 16-year sentence for sexual crimes committed in California is not affected by Thursday's ruling, though Weinstein's expected to appeal that conviction next. At least 87 survivors have accused Weinstein of rape or sexual misconduct. The U.S. Supreme Court appeared skeptical of Donald Trump's claim of absolute immunity from criminal prosecution for his attempts to overturn his 2020 election loss. This is liberal Justice Sonia Sotomayor questioning Trump's lawyers.
We would be creating a situation in which we would be saying, this is what you're asking us to say, which is that a president is entitled not to make a mistake, but more than that, a president is entitled for total personal gain to use the trappings of his office. That's what you're trying to get us to hold, without facing criminal liability.
Conservative justice questioned whether the charges against Trump constituted private acts or official acts, which could potentially be shielded from prosecution. But a resolution to the pivotal case could be further delayed, possibly beyond November's election, as the Supreme Court weighs sending the case back to lower courts for further deliberation. This comes as Trump's criminal hush money trial continues in New York. On Thursday, former National Enquirer publisher David Pecker told the court he made deals with Michael Cohen and Trump to kill embarrassing stories that would damage his presidential campaign, including Trump's alleged affair with Playboy model Karen McDougal. Burkina Faso's U.S.-trained military forces summarily executed at least 223 civilians, including dozens of children, across several villages in the northern Yatenga province in late February. That's according to a new report by Human Rights Watch, which says the extrajudicial mass killings are part of a widespread military campaign to exterminate residents accused of collaborating with Islamic militants. Human Rights Executive Director Tarana Hassan said in a statement, quote, "The repeated failure of the Burkinabe authorities to prevent and investigate such atrocities underlines why international assistance is critical to support a credible investigation into possible crimes against humanity." Haitian Prime Minister Ariel Henry has resigned, paving the way for an unelected transitional council to temporarily govern Haiti as the nation faces a worsening humanitarian and security crisis. On the streets of Haiti, locals remain skeptical.
We want to know if this council can fight the gangs, if they can win back security, because personally, I want to be able to go back to Port-au-Prince. If they can't fight the gangs, then I'm going to face them. I'm going to become their enemy. They got two missions, elections and security, but security comes first.
UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said Thursday he wants the swift deployment of a multinational security mission as the transitional government is installed. In Brazil, thousands of indigenous leaders have been rallying in Brasilia this week, calling on the government to recognize their ancestral lands and enforce stronger protections against illegal mining and other forms of exploitation. Protesters also denounced plans to build a railway that would transport grains across Brazil's farming states to ports in the Amazon rainforest. A group of indigenous leaders met with the Brazilian president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva, while others gathered outside government buildings.
In the past, we died by the knife, the bullet, and today we die by the pen, by making laws, by the law and taking away our rights. This is a huge genocide that can happen within our nation, within the people, because our indigenous land is life. For us, it is forest and life.
A sweltering heat wave across South and Southeast Asia has forced schools in India, the Philippines, and Bangladesh to suspend classes this week. Record temperatures have also disrupted agriculture across the region. The World Meteorological Organization warned Asia remains, quote, the world's most disaster-hit region from weather, climate, and water-related hazards. In Thailand, at least 30 people have been reported dead due to heat strokes so far this year. The Environmental Protection Agency finalized new rules Thursday requiring coal-fired power plants to either cut or capture 90% of their carbon dioxide emissions by 2032 or shut down. Power plants are the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions after transportation. But climate groups criticize the regulation's reliance on unproven technologies rather than reducing fossil fuel usage. The group Food and Water Watch said, quote, pretending that carbon capture can dramatically reduce climate pollution is nothing but a dangerous fantasy, they said. And the Federal Communications Commission voted to restore net neutrality Thursday in a major win for digital and consumer rights. The five-member commission voted 3-2 to fully reinstate rules established under President Obama and repealed by President Trump that regulated broadband like other utilities and barred internet providers from blocking or degrading certain websites or charging for faster connection. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. A wave of student protest against Israel's war in Gaza continues to spread from coast to coast across U.S. campuses. From California to Connecticut, students have set up Gaza solidarity encampments to call for an end to the Israeli assault and for university divestment from Israel and the U.S. arms industry. University administrators have responded by calling in law enforcement, forcibly removing encampments, arresting students and faculty, and suspending students. More than 500 arrests have been made on campuses nationwide in just over a week. One of the most violent police crackdowns took place at Emory University in Atlanta Thursday. Local and state police swept onto the campus just hours after students set up tents on the quad to protest Israel's war in Gaza, as well as the planned Atlanta Police Training Center known as Cop City. Police were accused of using tear gas, rubber bullets, and stun guns to break up the encampment as they wrestled people to the ground. One video shows multiple officers restraining a protester as they apply and hold a taser to his leg, as students around him yelled for them to stop. In an email addressing the situation shortly afterwards, the president of Emory University wrote several dozen individuals, quote, largely not affiliated with the university entered the campus for the protest, disrupting the Emory community amidst final exams. The university later said 20 of the 28 people arrested had ties to the school. Among those arrested were a number of faculty members, including the chair of the philosophy department at Emory University, Noelle McAfee. A bystander filmed her being led away in handcuffs.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is there anything I can do for you right now?
Yes, can you call the philosophy department office and tell them I've been arrested?
Philosophy department?
Yes, call the philosophy department office.
Well, Democracy Now! Spoke to Professor Noelle McAfee after she was released from custody on Thursday. She described what happened.
I was on campus this morning early for a long day meeting, and I saw that there was an encampment, and I heard some peaceful chanting. I thought I would just go and see how it was going, and also was concerned because in the past, Emory University has not just called out their own police to monitor things, but the Atlanta police. And a moment after I got there, I saw the troopers coming up. I'm not sure if they were the Georgia troopers or the Atlanta police, but they were coming up. The students were protesting with tents and all, and I was just wanting to watch, and I wandered over, and I saw suddenly things took a turn. The students got up to start marching, and then I couldn't see exactly from where I was. They were just being attacked by the police. Just over a few seconds. The police were attacking. I could hear rubber bullets. Then I smelled or tasted the tear gas. And then I saw in front of me a student on the ground with 3 or 4 policemen pummeling the student, just pummeling and pummeling. And I tried to video it. I was standing there about 3 feet away from it. And it went on for like a minute or two. And I screamed, "What are you doing?" And then they stopped pummeling the student, and a policeman stood in front of me and said, "You need to leave." And I felt like the person who just needed to stay and witness what had just happened. And so I stood there several feet away, and then he started dragging me off and putting my hands behind my back and took me in. He took me around the side, and there were a lot of students being arrested and processed, and also some other faculty members, and we were put in a van. The president sent out an email to the community shortly thereafter saying that these were outside agitators. But I was in a group of about 20, 25 Emory people who were being arrested. So this was a peaceful protest that became chaotic. At the moment the Atlanta police arrived and became very hostile.
Arrested Professor Noelle McAfee, the chair of the philosophy department at Emory University. Several Georgia legislators have criticized the police response at Emory yesterday. In a statement signed by at least 19 state Democratic lawmakers, they said they were, quote, deeply alarmed by reports of excessive force, writing, quote, the use of extreme anti-riot tactics by Georgia State Patrol, including tasers and gas, is a dangerous escalation to protests which were by all accounts peaceful and nonviolent, they wrote. For more on the protest at Emory University, we go to Atlanta, where we're joined by 2 guests. Emil Kameh is professor of English and Indigenous Studies at Emory University. He was also arrested at the campus yesterday, jailed for 4 hours, charged with disorderly conduct. And we're joined by Umaima Mohammed, an MD, PhD student, Palestinian-American organizer at Emory who took part in the protests. We welcome you both to Democracy Now! Professor Emil Kameh, you were arrested. Why were you out at the protest as people started to begin the encampment? And explain what happened to you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the opportunity to be here. Yeah, I was just going to work. I was going to my office to prepare my classes. I was supposed to teach yesterday, and then I ran into some of my students who were participating in the protest, and I went up to say hi to them, and they also saw some of my colleagues. So I was talking to them, and then somebody had mentioned that the university had called the police, and pretty soon they got there, and I literally felt that I was in a war zone when I saw the police with all the gear, and then like they immediately began to forcibly remove and destroy all the tents and forcibly remove students. I saw then that I started feeling the tear gas, and I held arms with some people that that we were being pushed back out of the encampment. And the student that I was holding arms with, she was then arrested, and then the next thing I know, I was on the floor, being forcibly on the floor, and I was being arrested. But yeah, it was like a horrible experience, very surreal, and yeah, unacceptable, really unacceptable, and it was just a horrible situation, a horrible experience.
Professor, the police are denying they used rubber bullets. What did you see?
So I did see somebody being tased, and then I saw the tear gas, and I felt it. I felt it in my eyes. I was also next to an older lady, and I was trying to reach her and try to see if I could offer some water. But then it's. I did see the footage, some of the videos of police using rubber bullets as well, but it was very forceful in screams, and yeah, it was very violent and really unacceptable.
The Emory administration has also had a similar response against Stop Cop City protests on campus. Can you talk about the connections between the two?
Yeah, I mean, the protesters were not only asking the university to divest from investing in Israel, but also Cop City. And I mean, it is the right thing to do. It's the right thing to do because it's, we have to remember that the university is on indigenous lands, and these are indigenous territories, and there was an eviction notice written by Muscovy leaders about not building Cap City in Atlanta, and it is a just demand. And hopefully the university will listen to what the students are saying about this, because I think it's really important.
I wanted to bring Umaima Mohammed into this conversation. Umaima, you're an MD, PhD student at Emory. Can you talk about these protests that you helped to organize and why you felt it was so key to take the stand on campus?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are past the 7-month mark of this genocide, and on our campus and in our community, we have repeatedly organized peacefully to put pressure on our institutions, especially at Emory, to stop harassing and doxing students and to stop repressing speech around Palestine and to divest from the Israeli apartheid state. And every single time, Emory shuts us down. Every single time they crack down and they punish students. Every single time they silence our voices. And at some point, we decided that we no longer accept our tuition dollars and our tax money going to fund an active genocide. And that was, I think, the main motivation for a group of students and community members and faculty and graduate students coming together so powerfully in this moment to say, we just reject this. We refuse to move until Emory listens to divesting from both the apartheid state of Israel and Stop Cop City.
I read an open letter that you had written. I mean, you're particularly deeply concerned about health care. You quoted the Palestinian doctor Hammam Allo, killed in November when an Israeli artillery shell struck his wife's home. His father, brother-in-law, and father-in-law also died. Democracy Now! Spoke to Dr. Allo on October 31st. This was his response when I asked him why he refused to leave his patients.
And if I go, who treats my patients? We are not animals. We have the right to receive proper health care. So we can just leave. You think I went to medical school and for my postgraduate degrees for a total of 14 years, so I think only about my life and not my patients?
Dr. Hammam Allo would be killed several weeks later. Umaima Mohammed, can you talk about this issue of what we're seeing at this point, over 34,000 Palestinians killed, the number of doctors and nurses, staff, universities, and why this is of particular concern to you?
Yeah, so as a future healthcare professional and a current medical student, I am deeply concerned about the lack of concern healthcare institutions in America have for what we're seeing. And it's not just in Palestine. Healthcare professionals largely aren't invested in the health and care of community members, like the police violence we saw on Emory's campus. I mean, it's absolutely mind-boggling to me that these people call themselves providers and care workers and are deeply disinvested from the structural and state violence of community members, both locally and internationally. And I used that quote in a letter that I wrote to the School of Medicine a few months ago because of the absolute silence from a healthcare institution on the decimation of the healthcare system in Gaza, on their own peers being murdered in cold blood by the IDF. And so I think one of the concerns that I have with Emory and with the School of Medicine specifically is that they have also, along with the greater Emory community, participated in suppressing Palestinian voices. So a great example of this is very early on to this genocide in October, Emory fired a Palestinian physician for posting a private social media post on her Facebook in support of the Palestinians. And yet, one of the professors of medicine we have at Emory recently went to serve as a volunteer medic in the Israeli Defense Force and recently came back. This man participated in aiding and abetting a genocide and aiding and abetting the destruction of the healthcare system in Gaza and the murder of over 400 healthcare workers, and is now back at Emory, so-called teaching medical students and residents how to take care of patients. I mean, the disconnect is, for me, very obvious, and it's very frustrating that the School of Medicine and the greater Emory community continues to ignore these major disconnects.
I'm wondering, as we wrap up, Umaima Mohammed, you're a medical student, about GILI, the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange, and this connection between Cop City, which would be the largest police training facility in the country that is being protested as it's being built in Atlanta, and the Atlanta police and Israel, what this is all about.
Absolutely. So GILI, like you said, is the Georgia International Law Enforcement Exchange Program, and it was started in the 90s at a university, at Georgia State University. And the function of this program is to exchange local police with international police forces. But what this program has become majorly is a connection between the Atlanta Police Force and the Israeli Defense Force. So they send Atlanta police, along with people like medics and first responders, over to train under a military that is illegally occupying land in Palestine to better learn surveillance techniques, to better learn tactics on how to suppress and repress protesters in Atlanta. And they bring back these techniques that are highly militarized and violent and use them against students. And in fact, yesterday we had a Palestinian student speak who said the last time that she experienced what was a war zone on Emory's campus was when she was in occupied Palestine. When we were tear gassed, all she could see was the vision of when she was in occupied Palestine, similarly being tear gassed, with those tear gas canisters saying made in the USA. And so what we're seeing happening is an exchange between the Atlanta police and the Israeli Defense Force, which is currently committing a genocide, to exchange tactics on how to better surveil, repress, and harm community members.
And finally, just 10 seconds, but as you talk about the Israeli Defense Force, you're referring to what's officially known as the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces. Can you explain why you call them the IOF?
Right. So we reject the idea that the Israeli Defense Force is defending anything legitimate. The Israeli Defense Force has always been on the offensive, effectively enacting ethnic cleansing against the Palestinians, effectively stealing land, creating illegal settlements, checkpoints, creating conditions that are highly unlivable for Palestinians. And that's why we use the language Israeli Defense Force, not the IDF.
This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Juan Gonzalez in Chicago. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
As Israel's assault on Gaza enters its 200th day, Palestinian solidarity protests and encampments are spreading on college campuses across the United States, inspired by the Gaza Solidarity encampment at Columbia University. Here in New York, police raided a student encampment at New York University Monday night. Police arrested more than 150 people, including students and 20 faculty members. Earlier on Monday, police at Yale University arrested 60 protesters, including 47 students who'd set up an encampment to demand the school divest from weapons manufacturers. At Columbia, the student encampment has entered its 7th day. On Monday night, about 100 Columbia student protesters and faculty took part in a Gaza Liberation Seder to mark the start of the Jewish holiday of Passover, or Pesach. On Monday, hundreds of Columbia professors held a mass walkout. This is Columbia history professor Christopher Brown.
Thursday, April 18, 2024, will be remembered as a shameful day in Columbia's history. The president's decision to send riot police to pick up peaceful protesters on our campus was unprecedented, unjustified, disproportionate, divisive, and dangerous.
Student encampments are now in place at numerous other schools, including University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, University of California, Berkeley, University of Maryland, MIT, and Emerson College in Boston. We're joined now by two professors. Joseph Slaughter is Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature at Columbia University. He's the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights, which put out a public statement condemning the repression of student protests at Columbia and the calling in of the New York police, who made over 100 arrests. Also with us, New York University professor Helga Tawil-Suri. She's a leading Palestinian-American scholar of media, culture, and communication, co-editor of the book Gaza as Metaphor. Okay, we're going to begin with New York University, with Professor Tawil-Suri. You have been at the encampment since it began at NYU Monday morning at 4, and you just came from jail support, where, over 140 people, including 20 of your peers, NYU professors, were arrested. Can you explain what's going on at NYU?
Yeah, sure. So the students decided to start an encampment yesterday, early in the morning, in support of Gaza, in support of Palestine, also kind of in support, obviously, of other students and Columbia and otherwise. And very early on, already from the very beginning of the first tent being set up, the NYU security guards came and NYPD came. But quickly, kind of a sort of de-escalation, if you want, kind of took place between faculty members and security guards, and NYPD left, and it was peaceful all day long. There was a lot of sort of negotiation back and forth between the faculty and the security guards on behalf of the students. And at some point in the afternoon, kind of, things like police presence was kind of escalating. And the negotiations kind of stopped, and at some point the NYU security guards were like, all right, well, they made it pretty clear that NYPD presence was just sort of imminent at that point, and kind of started coming up with all kinds of reasons as to why they were going to show up and so on, kind of kept pushing the bar in different directions. And then the NYPD came, faculty kind of had made a sort of front line kind of buffer zone at the very beginning. They were arrested very quickly. And then the police force kind of forced in their way into this sort of plaza where the students where the students had their tents set up, and extremely violently kind of took down all the tents, were throwing chairs around, and then arrested all of the students that were there, and then also had a third wave of arrests of other people that were kind of still in that area as well. So yeah, 20 faculty members ended up in prison. Were arrested, and I think the number of total arrests was around 140, 145.
And Professor Tawil Suri, was that at any time were the students in any way disrupting the classes in the university or the business of the university?
I mean, not really. I mean, in the sense that, they got there pretty early in the morning, and very quickly NYU security guards decided to kind of barricade that area. So if anybody was disrupting, it was actually NYU security and not the students, because they were the ones who kind of set up all the barriers and would forbid students whether they were coming for the encampment or just trying to get to class, would not actually let them access that way. So they had to kind of go all the way around. And so on. And so there was very little movement in terms of, letting people in or out of the encampment. And we had to sort of negotiate, like for bathroom breaks and stuff like that. And, the disruption, I mean, we're told that, the disruption was part of the protest, right, and the chanting and the singing. But, it's New York City. It's really loud. There was construction right across the street. So it's really hard for me to understand that was a sort of disruption. So really the disruption, I think, was much more on the part of the security guards who really sort of blocked off that entire area.
And to your knowledge, did the administration or the president have any discussions with the NYU faculty before calling in the police?
So I myself and a number of my colleagues, in terms of like NYU faculty, sort of went back and forth numerous times with a couple of the deans and and the head of NYU security. And so kind of negotiated sort of back and forth about, can we let the kids out to the bathroom? Can we come in? Can we go out? Can we bring more people in? Can we bring more people out? But not directly with the president of the university, but just mostly the head of security. And a couple of times with the NYPD, certainly early in the morning. And, I mean, one of the things that we've seen the response of the president of the university saying that, there was a breach in the barrier. And I mean, I could tell you I was there all day. That breach in the barrier is really not a breach in that sense. I mean, there were a couple of students who sort of went in. I think the concern was as to whether or not we could control whether the people that were going on to the plaza were NYU students. And so we offered numerous times, like, well, we're happy to go around and kind of ask all the students for their ID cards. And at some point, the security guard said, okay, fine, we'll do this. And then suddenly they said no, and they sort of came up with all sorts of reasons as to why we weren't kind of following rules, and ultimately, claimed that we were trespassing on our own campus, right? I mean, it's a presumably private part of the university, and it was, NYU students and NYU faculty that are then charged with trespassing and then violently kind of thrown out from that space.
I want to bring Professor Joseph Slaughter into this conversation. You're at Columbia. You're Associate Professor of English and Comparative Literature there, and you're the Executive Director of the Institute for the Study of Human Rights at Columbia University. It was your president, President Minouchery Shafiq, who called out the New York Police Department. This was a day after she testified before Congress. Can you talk about your response to the encampment and then the arrest of over 100 students?
Thank you, Amy. I certainly can. So the response that we had at the Institute for the Study of Human Rights was that we immediately recognized the infringement of student rights to protest peacefully and freedoms of speech on campus, and the dramatic threat. It raised the bringing in the police, the university president calling in the police, raised immediately, of course, the specter of 68, which I'm glad you'll be talking about. You'll be talking about a minute later. There are a number of things I would like to say about the bringing in of the police. We have actually, in the wake of 1968, a very strong set of university statutes that include things like protections for speech and protest on campus. They effectively are the Constitution of Columbia University. They are the product of the good product of 1968, establishing systems of shared governance between faculty, students, and the administration. And there are emergency powers that the president has to protect faculty, students, the Columbia community in the case of imminent threats to people and property on campus that are spelled out loosely in the university statutes. The president, however, has an absolute obligation, it's spelled out very clearly, to consult with the executive committee of the University Senate, which includes students and faculty, before bringing any external police forces onto campus. In this case, she approached on the very first day of the Columbia encampment, which was a peaceful nonviolent protest, not disturbing, in my opinion, the Columbia environment, the Columbia campus, and certainly posing no threat to persons or property. She approached the executive committee of the University Senate, asking for their permission to invite the NYPD in to shut down, to squelch the protest. The executive committee, the faculty and the students on the executive committee voted unanimously to reject her request to bring in to bring in New York police. She did it anyway, thus violating not only the statutes, in my opinion, certainly the long traditions of shared governance, the long traditions of protest and protections of speech on campus, as well as the compact between students, faculty, and the administration to act unilaterally, essentially throwing out the rule book and throwing out the Constitution, the statutes of the university.
And Professor Slaughter, this whole issue of within 24 hours, students receiving notices of suspensions, what kind of a due process occurred here?
That's a great question, and I think it's something that's extremely important for people to understand. In the letter that President Shafiq sent to the NYPD, the chief of police, asking them for their intervention, she claimed that the students were being suspended for violations of university policies, and that therefore they were trespassing on Columbia property. The 108 students who were arrested were charged with trespassing. However, in fact, the vast majority of those students, there were a number of exceptions from Barnard apparently, but the vast majority of those students were in fact not suspended until 24 hours after the arrests. The suspension notices that the students received now cite the arrests themselves as part of the cause for suspension. In other words, the logic was circular. They called in the New York Police Department on the premise that the students were trespassing when they hadn't yet been suspended, and they are now suspended on the premise that they had violated New York trespassing laws, and therefore therefore needed to be suspended and were guilty. In my opinion, the NYPD were called in under false pretenses by the president of the university.
I wanted to get your response to the New York police chief, John Chell, said that President Shafiq identified the demonstration as a clear and present danger, but that officers found the students to be peaceful and cooperative.
I think this is also something that's absolutely important for people to know. In fact, John Chell, the chief of patrol, said that this disavowed the language of clear and present danger. The president had used the language, the exact language taken from the university statutes of clear and present danger to the substantial functioning of the university. She did not, however, say that the students posed a clear and present danger to persons and property, which are the two primary criteria for bringing in police onto campus to protect the Columbia community. In other words, at the moment in which she was making a speech for which she could be held legally responsible, that is, writing to the police department to call in the police department, she refused to use to say that the students were a clear and present danger to Columbia faculty and persons and property. In other words, while she was sending messaging out, while the university administration was sending messaging out through all of its channels, by email and public announcements, saying that these students posed a danger, that's not the language they used to talk to invite the police in. The chief of patrol said, in fact, that the students posed no danger, disavowed the language of clear and present danger, saying that's President Shafiq's words, not his, and that the students were protesting peacefully, saying what they wanted to say peacefully, and in no way resisted arrest.
What happened yesterday? Talk about you have the student encampment on the South Lawn, and then you have the professors going into Low Library for a meeting.
So the university is being run as a sort of adhocracy at this point. The senior administration making up policies and procedures and prohibitions on the fly, changing them in the middle of the night. One of those prohibitions was that no protests could take place on the steps of Low Library. I assume you will be showing images later about protests in 1968 of Low Library. The faculty, in response, a broad coalition of faculty, in response to the student arrests and to the bringing of police onto campus, chose yesterday to walk out at 2 p.m. in full regalia for many of us, to stand on the steps of Low Library in front of the statue of Alma Mater, a heralded tradition of protest on campus, to defend our students, to defend the rights of students, to denounce the police actions and the president's sanctioning of the police actions, to call for the immediate repeal of the suspension of our students, their restoration of all of their rights, the expungement of their records, and to submit an appeal for a vote of censure in the University Senate of Manoush Shafiq and our senior administration.
And Professor Slaughter, not only at Columbia, but at universities across the country, we are repeatedly hearing that these protests in support of the Palestinians who are being attacked in Gaza, that this is making life unsafe. These protests are making life unsafe for Jewish students on these campuses. What's your response to that?
So I have multiple responses. The messaging out of Columbia has consistently emphasized the dangers of these protests, in particular to Jewish and Israeli and pro-Israeli students. In fact, the messaging has been one of fear. towards those students explicitly. The messaging at the same time has been one of fear to students, to pro-Palestinian students, to anti-Zionist Jewish students, to other students who want to think about and talk about and discuss the questions of Palestine, the questions of Israel, which is the duty of a university to think about these hard problems. The message to those students is also fear, but a fear by omission. The university not ever acknowledging any of the fears, the Islamophobic actions that are taking place on campus, any of the attacks that have taken place on campus. And so in some ways, the university itself, it seems to me, in its public messaging since October, has ginned up fear both among Jewish students and pro-Palestinian students. The campus, in fact, the kind of impromptu and improvised policies that the administration has unilaterally imposed without consultation from the University Senate, without the traditions of shared governance, have in fact, in my opinion, chilled speech, not just of pro-Palestinian protesters, but also of pro-Israeli protesters, and has absolutely chilled speech in classrooms and in other kind of forums on campus to be able to even talk about the problems that lie at the bottom of all of this. That is Palestinian rights to self-determination, Israeli rights to security.
And Professor Tawil Suri, what do you see happening in the coming days at NYU?
Oh, it's hard to say, but maybe quickly, if I could just add one thing. I mean, a lot of the students and the faculty at NYU who were part of the encampment and in general are part of sort of like SJP and FJP and so on are actually Jewish, right? So that's number one. The other thing that I think is I mean, I don't know how much news has sort of come out since yesterday about what happened, but when the NYPD finally came in and sort of broke the encampment apart, it was in the middle of Muslim Maghrib prayers, like the evening prayers, right? So I think that kind of speaks a little bit to what you're saying, right? In terms of like the way that it's not really about sort of one group or the other, but also how different groups are kind of treated. In terms of what happens at NYU from this point on, I mean, I can tell you the students feel very sort of spirited in the sense of like they want to kind of continue. For them, it's about, okay, fine, you took us down, but we're going to continue. We have the right to protest, we have the right to academic speech, we have the right to free speech, and we have the right to kind of stand up for our pro-Palestinian voices, basically. I'm not quite sure, I mean, I can't sort of say how the university is going to respond, but, I think the students are going to sort of have to figure out, like, how are they going to be able to protest? So unlike Columbia, NYU is this kind of, somewhat urban kind of campus, right? So there is no lawn, if you want, to kind of go and protest on. And so I think that's part of what we saw yesterday is this plaza where the encampment took place is private property, but the moment you step off of the steps, it becomes a New York City property, right? So there's a very sort of blurry line as to where does the NYPD kind of sort of stop its sort of jurisdiction, if you want to call it that, versus where does campus security stop. So I think that's a little bit different in terms of NYU, and I think that's a sort of challenge, if you want, that is faced by the students. But I think the students kind of are very resolved in the sense of like, we're going to keep going with this.
Professor Tawil Suri, the New York Times subheadline was dozens were arrested on Monday at NYU and Yale, but officials there and at campuses across the U.S. are running out of options to corral protests, they said. What are the options that officials have at these universities besides arrests and suspensions?
That's a great question. I mean, maybe first to kind of have a discussion, right? Like kind of, be sort of very open about like, all right, well, let's sort of sit down and talk about these things. Let's host a number of different events. Let's host a number of different speakers. Let's allow for these kind of speakers and events to happen. I think what we see is also a sort of shutdown of certain kinds of things, right? Let's allow for whether it's classes or teach-ins or all of that. And in terms of the protesters, I mean, yesterday there was a sort of, I think part of what happened certainly at NYU is that there was a kind of oppression, if you will, right? So people in support were coming to sort of demonstrate and speak with the students and so on, but couldn't kind of access, right? So they bleed into the street, and the students can't get out, and so it's sort of a bit of a sort of pressure cooker in the sense that you of course you're creating this kind of barricade that becomes very difficult to manage, but it's also becoming a way that the barrier itself is actually creating part of the problem, right? So I think if you kind of have a way to kind of figure out how to sort of allow people to move around, to not necessarily prevent them from moving, I think a lot of problems would kind of not exist to begin with.
Same question, Professor Slaughter.
Thank you. One of the things that President Shafiq said in response to a question at Congress last week that I found most disturbing, that hasn't been commented on at all, is that what she's learned over this last 6 months is that our rules weren't made for this moment, and this justifies in some ways the administration throwing out the rule book and coming up with impromptu policies on how to police speech. In fact, the rules were made exactly for this moment. They were made for 1968. They were made from 1968, and to prevent a repeat of 1968. We have an extremely robust rules for the protections of speech and protest on campus. We have an extremely robust system for protecting due process rights for students when they have violated or are accused of having violated those protections. If this administration had chosen to lean into the statutes of the university and the rules that have kept our community together for 50 years, we would be in a much better place with faculty and students on board.
Well, I'm glad you went back in history, because that's where we're going right now. Professor Slaughter of Columbia University and Professor Helga Tawil-Suri of New York University. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. 56 years ago today, hundreds of students at Columbia University here in New York started a revolt on campus. They occupied 5 buildings, including the president's office and law library. The students barricaded themselves inside the buildings for a week. They were protesting Columbia's ties to military research and plans to build a university gymnasium in a public park in Harlem. The protests began less than 3 weeks after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. The 1968 Columbia uprising led to one of the largest mass arrests in New York City history. A week into the strike, April 30th, New York City police stormed the campus of Columbia University. Hundreds of students were injured, 700 arrested. Images of the police assault were broadcast around the country. This is a clip from Columbia Revolt by Third World Newsreel.
They got over 700 of us on charges of criminal trespass, resisting arrest, all kinds of other, some of which was real and some of which was completely fake.
I know of nurses and doctors that pleaded with the police not to proceed, to please let these men alone, and they would say, no, that's get away, this is our job.
I was arrested. They would not allow me to see a doctor. I had broken ribs, my face was cut, I got hit with a pistol under the eye, and I was bleeding there, and I wasn't allowed to see a doctor until I got out of court, which was approximately 10 hours later.
But I was awarded a fellowship for next year. What the hell does... I'm sorry. What does it mean? I'm going to strike, but I hope every I don't see how any teacher, I don't see how any student can attend this school anymore. And I was completely liberal about the whole thing, but this bus has radicalized everybody, and me very personally.
No, I was a non-violent student. I was completely passive. I didn't care what happened. I was completely neutral. I'm not neutral any longer. I'll occupy buildings tomorrow.
The 1968 Columbia uprising inspired student protests across the country. This is Democracy Now!'s Juan Gonzalez, then a Columbia student, speaking during the strike.
Now we want to go into the dorms with all of you, with some of you who may not agree with a lot of what we've been saying here, who have questions, who support us, who want to know more. Let's go to the dorms. Let's talk quietly in small groups. We'll be there, and everyone in Livingston Lobby, Infernal Lobby, and Carmen Lobby. We'll be there, and we'll talk about the issues involved, and we'll talk about where this country is going, and where this university is going, and what it's doing in its society, and what we would looking to do and what we would and how we would like to exchange with you our ideas over it. Come join us now.
That was Juan Gonzalez, courtesy of the Pacifica Radio Archives. And Juan is here now, courtesy of Democracy Now!, co-host of Democracy Now! Juan, talk about that moment. We're talking about 56 years ago. Talk about then and what you see as the echoes of today.
Well, Amy, I think the important thing to understand is that the Colombia strike unfolded over several weeks. The first week was the week of the occupation, but because of the brutality of the attacks by the police, as you said, more than 150 people were hospitalized the night of April 30th. It led to a massive strike of the entire university. Over 10,000 students shut the university down for the rest of the semester. And I think what is really unusual about this process is that here the university moved in very quickly, and also these students were not disrupting classes. We occupied buildings. We did not allow classes to go forward in 1968. The classes were going forward. The students were camped out peacefully on the lawn. So the disproportionate nature of the response of the university, the quickness with which it responded without even consulting or listening to the faculty is really astounding. And the other aspect of it is that when we were suspended, and there were many of us suspended, before we were suspended, we were allowed to appear before a tribunal to plead our cause. There was at least the rudiments of due process. Here, there is no due process. The university is already within 24 hours saying that the students are suspended, even though there is yet no legal proof that any of these students knowingly participated in illegal action. So I think that what really strikes me about this response is the total flouting of any kind of democratic process by the current administration compared to what happened in 1968. And of course, I think the other aspect of it is we were fighting at the time against the racism of the university toward Harlem and against the Vietnam War. These students are protesting a genocide that is occurring before the eyes of the entire world, and that is being funded by U.S. arms. And if anyone has the right to rebel and to stand up against injustice, these students do. And I personally only wish that more students would follow their examples across the country and continue to disrupt disrupt the process that is occurring right now to at least allow the people of Palestine to understand that the American people are not united behind this genocide.
And Juan, do you have messages for the college presidents from your experience 56 years ago with the mass arrests of 700 students, which only provoked more protests?
Well, I have to say that President Shafiq, who I understand is a baroness, she was knighted during her time in England, that the baroness has very little time left as president of Columbia University. I don't see how she survives in office, given the enormous resistance to her of not only the students but the faculty. And I think that the universities across America have to realize that the young people of this country do not support the constant wars that are imperial wars that our government is either participating in or funding, and that something has to change.
Well, this is a discussion that will continue as we move into graduation season. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. We spend the rest of the hour with Jane McAlevey, the great labor organizer, scholar, and writer whose influence was felt when Volkswagen employees at the Chattanooga, Tennessee factory overwhelmingly voted last week to join the United Auto Workers Union. The plant will become the first foreign-owned car factory in the South to unionize. The decisive victory comes in the wake of the historic strike and contract gains with the U.S. auto industry industry's big three companies last year. The UAW has pledged to unionize auto workers across the country. On Sunday, UAW President Shawn Fain spoke at a conference organized by Labor Notes.
4,000 workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee did what many people said was impossible. You know, we did what the pundits said couldn't be done. Every time I was interviewed by people, when we talked about organizing the South, they would always do an eye roll and say, do you really think you can win in the South? And you know what? Those workers stood up for themselves. That's how we won, and they voted for a union.
The UAW is now bracing for its next fight, a union vote in Vance, Alabama, at one of Mercedes' two non-union U.S. plants, the company's only non-union plants worldwide. This comes as Supreme Court justices are hearing oral arguments in a case filed by Starbucks against the National Labor Relations Board, the NLRB, which could make it harder to address corporate interference in union drives. For more, we turn to Jane McAlevey. She's been an organizer in the labor movement for more than 20 years, the author of 4 books, including Rules to Win By, Power and Participation in Union Negotiations, written with Abby Lawler. She's also the author of A Collective Bargain, Unions Organizing and the Fight for Democracy, as well as other books. It's great to have you with us, Jane. We're going to talk about 2 issues. Your remarkable you as a role model and strategist in the union movement, and also taking on your own struggle right now. But I want to start with Chattanooga and the significance of the UAW victory.
Yeah, because it's such a great story. I mean, you had 4,300 auto workers in Chattanooga, Tennessee, on their 3rd try. Honestly, they should have had a union there 10 years ago, 6 years ago. But this win wasn't just a win. It was what we would call a beatdown, honestly. I mean, they beat the employer by 72%. The numbers are astounding. So part of what was so great about it is they showed in Chattanooga a lot of what I have been talking and writing and practicing about for decades, which is they had a supermajority strategy. They said they wouldn't file for election until they had what we call a supermajority of the workers engaged on public petitions saying we're ready to vote yes. And when you lead with a public petition that says we're ready to vote yes, you are signaling to the employer, we're coming to get you. And that's exactly what they did. They were having parties, they were having T-shirt parties, they were walking around in red T-shirts in that plant for weeks leading up to the election. They were messaging all the things that those of us who win really hard campaigns, and I don't know any campaign anymore that isn't hard. It's all the stuff that we do. Those of us who have just kept winning in the last 40 years while too many national labor leaders sat around debating, we can't really win, we have to change labor law, we have to do all these things, when all we have to do is actually start trusting that workers are really intelligent, that if we teach them what it takes to win, which is building super-majority organization before the election, that's going to carry them into a great first contract fight. And that's just what they did in Chattanooga, and I hope they're going to march right into Alabama and do the same, because that's going to really rock the House of the South of this country if we walk this into the Mercedes plant on May 17th.
And yes, and I wanted to ask you about that, Jane, the Alabama struggle, and also this whole issue of unionizing these foreign car companies that have moved increasingly established plants here in the United States, and especially in the South.
Juan, by the way, good to see you. Amy as well. Yeah, I mean, this was, look, Volkswagen didn't have a single auto plant in the world that didn't have a union. So the idea that, like, the United States South is such a right-wing bastion of anti-trade unionism that the one place in the world where workers didn't have a union was the United States South tells you a lot about how broken U.S. labor law is. The Economic Policy Institute, EPI, said recently from some recent polling, 60 million American workers would have a union tomorrow if they were allowed to vote free and fair. And what we're seeing at Mercedes is different than Chattanooga. In Chattanooga, there was an agreement with IG Metall, with the German union, that helped. It didn't totally mitigate what the employer was doing in Chattanooga, but it helped calm down the kind of vicious tactical warfare that we're starting to see already in the Mercedes plant, where they have posters up that say things like, the UAW endorsed Joe Biden. Is that a Southern union? So they're starting to run. They have fired several people just in the last week in the Mercedes plant. So I think once the Chattanooga numbers came in and Mercedes looked at Volkswagen and said, well, this was a beatdown. This was a total extraordinary victory in Chattanooga, Tennessee. The momentum is changing. They decided that they were going to go all out to start trying to bust the union. So now until May 17th, when that vote count happens, every one of us needs to be emailing, asking the UAW for anything that they can do to support those workers. But it's a Alabama-driven campaign. And one thing I want to say about this that's really important before I pause is just the worker committee in the Mercedes plant is an incredible worker-led movement with staff support for sure, right? You need professional staff in this country, given the union busting laws, to help give you advice. But that movement in the Mercedes plant in particular is a seriously worker-driven campaign, and I can't wait for those workers to vote yes. It'll be a massive change in the U.S. South.
And I wanted to ask you about the role of Shawn Fain here. He spoke at a Labor Notes conference. For people who are not familiar with Labor Notes, this is the organization that has been backing rank-and-file movements for decades. And to have a UAW president speak at a Labor Notes conference in itself is highly unusual. I'm wondering your sense of the impact of the democracy movement that occurred within the UAW and its effect on the labor movement.
Yeah, I mean, this is a source of personal joy because I'm a UAW member for many years, including that I was part of the 48,000 worker strike. So I had the pleasure of voting in the ballot initiative to get direct democracy in the United Auto Workers, and then I had the pleasure of pulling the lever for Shawn Fain and doing some fundraisers on the West Coast with a bunch of folks for him. So to watch him go from winning the election, contested, highly contested, basically taking over in early March, walking into what was their national negotiations, every 4 years, their national negotiations conference in late March, going into and leading a series of unprecedented strikes that resulted in incredible victories, had a direct impact on the workers in Chattanooga deciding, hey, we want some of that, right? Like, we want to top out at $40 an hour instead of the low 30s that we top out at right now in Chattanooga, Tennessee. So Shawn Fain is already becoming the kind of trade union leader that we need many, many more of. And I am thrilled that he is my union president. And I'm thrilled that